In the mid-2010s, the esports craze was really starting to hit its peak. Games like League of Legends, Counter-Strike, and Rainbow Six Siege were not only building themselves from the ground up to be intensely competitive experiences, but they were also offering the largest prize pools seen in competitive gaming history and reaching record-breaking levels of viewership while doing so. So, of course, other major publishers like Capcom were bound to notice this massive influx in attention and hop on the trend themselves. But for some reason, when Capcom sat down to look at all of the hundreds of titles they'd published over the decades of their successful reign in the gaming market, they figured that out of all of them, the Resident Evil franchise would be the best choice for capitalizing on this trend. So in September of 2015, we would see the reveal of what would go on to become the single most universally hated entry in the long and storied history of Resident Evil, Umbrella Corps. As you might expect, Resi fans weren't exactly thrilled by the idea of the next game in the series being a competitive multiplayer shooter built to compete with the other esports titans on the market, and they were so not thrilled by this idea that Umbrella Corps would go on to be a massive failure for Capcom and was quite literally dead on arrival. On its release date in June of 2016, the game would only see a peak of 428 players. That player count would then dwindle into the 50s within a couple weeks, and by the 3-month anniversary of the game coming out, the highest player count seen in the entire month of September would be 12 players. But this has always just made me even more curious about Umbrella Corps over the years. Sure, it's not a concept that really any RE fans were hoping for back then, so the game's failure makes perfect sense, but the fact that so few even played the game means that there's barely any discussion about what this game was actually like. So over the last week, I've sat down and actually played Umbrella Corps for the first time, sinking a solid amount of hours into the game to see what it was actually like and ultimately determine if this game deserved its fate. So if you'll join me, let's talk about the failures and the successes of the most hated Resident Evil game. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 23rd in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you might enjoy them if you're a big Resident Evil fan, or just want to know what I think about the other entries in the series. So for those of you that are interested in checking those out first, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Umbrella Corps is a tactical multiplayer shooter developed and published by Capcom in 2016 for the PlayStation 4 and PC. Now, despite what you might think, given this was a multiplayer game built for competition, Umbrella Corps does actually feature a small single-player campaign called The Experiment, so we'll start things off by talking about that. The basic story here is that the game takes place after the events of Resident Evil 6, and we play as an agent working for the Umbrella Corps, codenamed 3A7, and we're sent on various missions by them to collect data from the sites of previous outbreaks, as well as test new experimental equipment for them. All of the story content is given to us through simple text walls before and after each mission, which, while definitely lackluster, is at least something. Most competitive multiplayer titles from this era didn't even bother to include any sort of single-player offering or story mode, so as light as it might be in Umbrella Corps, I'll definitely take it over nothing. As these experiments go on though, we start to get little bits of intrigue sprinkled throughout, like how our handler tells us that some mysterious man has shown up to monitor our missions, who seemingly has everyone on edge, and talks about the outbreak sites from RE4 and 5 as if he's been there before. A lot of these don't get any payoff, such as the man from that example never really being mentioned again after this or having his identity revealed, but there are some tiny threads here that you could definitely dig into and start to really theorize about what's going on just outside of our character's point of view. And in classic Umbrella fashion, once you've completed all of the trials they wanted you to, they deem you as being too dangerous to keep you around and attempt to send you to the Arctic base from Code Veronica to die. If you're able to survive this though, your former handler will send you one final message about how terrifyingly efficient you are and dubbing you the new Grim Reaper, effectively making the player character from the experiment a sort of Hunk 2.0. So the story isn't much to write home about, as it basically just exists to establish who you are and why you're going to these old outbreak zones and fighting other operatives and BOWs in the multiplayer. But thank God there's at least some sort of single player offering included here. Oh, and before people ask, maps of some places like the Spencer Mansion or Raccoon City that should be destroyed by this point in the story have been explained away as being recreations by the Umbrella Corps for the sake of testing. So, as weak as it might be, there is a reason for these being here. The actual missions in the single player are pretty lacking though, since they're basically just solo multiplayer matches. In every mission, you'll be deployed to one of the multiplayer maps and given a certain objective. And these objectives have also just been pulled from the various multiplayer modes, but obviously they're only the ones that can be completed without any other actual players in the lobby with you. This limits the pool of objectives to a grand total of 3, with these being either killing BOWs and collecting their DNA, securing sites scattered around the map, or collecting briefcases that are also scattered around the map. This leads to the missions themselves being fine at first, but they definitely get old by the time that you finish all of the 24 missions that this game will throw at you, as you are quite literally just doing the same 3 things over and over again. The single player also lacks any sort of progression, which I find really strange. There's always at least 1 or 2 weapons laying around the maps to pick up during each of these missions, which, as they are, just grant the player those weapons until the end of that mission. But I feel like these pickups could have been used to allow players to unlock new weapons or attachments, and then customize their loadout between missions to just add a little bit of progression to things here. This also would have allowed players to experiment with loadouts more and figure out what guns they like, what attachments they want to put on them, and all sorts of stuff in an offline environment where you're not worried about getting stomped by other players. But alas, these pickups only exist as a short-term power boost rather than a form of long-term progression. And finally, we have what I found to be my biggest issue with the single player, that being its awful difficulty curve. See, in the early single-player missions, things are insanely easy, like far too easy. You'll be running through maps that are only filled with basic zombies that have had their damage significantly reduced to prevent you from actually dying to them, doing nothing but the missions where you kill BOWs and collect their samples over and over again. This makes the early portion of the single player mind-numbingly easy, even for players like me who have never played the game before. But around the midpoint of the campaign, missions actually feel pretty good difficulty-wise, and they also add in those secure site and collect briefcase objectives just to inject some more variety and keep things from getting too boring. They're not too easy, not too hard, at least a little varied, and just a solid challenge for new players that helps ease them into the gameplay and mechanics of Umbrella Corps. But then, we have roughly the last third of the campaign. And here, we start to have some massive problems again, as the difficulty spikes to a ridiculous degree near the end. To start, they actually turn up the damage of the BOWs to make it so that no matter what enemy hits you, you will always die in 2 hits. Then they put you into some of the smallest maps the game has to offer, while also cranking up the number of enemy spawns relative to what they would normally be, leading to the player just constantly ending up in situations where you not only die in the blink of an eye, but also where you get cornered by enemies very easily due to there just being way too many for the amount of space that you're given. And as if that's not enough, they also throw in some of the strongest mutated enemies in the game to ensure that there are some tankier enemies in there that allow the BOWs to run you down even if your aim and reflexes are on point, because these guys will just tank 2 to 3 magazines from your rifles or SMGs before actually going down. It makes the last few missions of the single player absolutely infuriating, as on top of just being bored by this point in the game, I felt like I was also repeatedly insta-dying thanks to situations that were intentionally designed to be nearly impossible to survive. So overall, I thought the single player of Umbrella Corps was pretty bad. It has the most bare minimum story possible, incredibly low effort missions with little to no variety between them, 0 progression, and a difficulty curve that ranges from so easy it's boring to a brand new player, to so infuriating that I want to punch a hole in my wall frat house style. I really have nothing nice to say about the single player, other than the fact that it simply exists, as Umbrella Corps will never be rendered entirely unplayable by an inevitable server shutdown thanks to its existence. But aside from preserving at least some of the game's legacy, there's nothing here that I like. So let's just move on to the rest of the game before this becomes a giant rant video. Which I say as if that's not what you all clicked on this video expecting, but let's move on regardless. As far as the presentation goes, I think this game actually has some solid visuals, though they do just feel a bit weird in certain ways. Umbrella Corps was developed in-house by Capcom's Osaka branch, but interestingly, it's the first time in a long while that we've seen Capcom ditch their MT framework engine, as they actually developed this game in Unity for some reason. This gives the game a generally cleaner and more modernized look than something like RE6, but things like the super tight field of view and very hit or miss models for the BOWs definitely hold things back a bit. It definitely has a stylish presentation with that interesting third person that's so close to your character that it's almost first person camera, and while this wouldn't look amazing for a AAA single player title in 2016, it actually looked damn good for a competitive multiplayer game of the time. As far as actually playing the game though, it feels really nice. The mechanics all have a pretty good feel to them, and despite how fast the pace of the game is, it all blends together pretty smoothly. At least once you've managed to wrap your head around the awkward control scheme. See, this game made some really strange decisions with the controls, like having the F key on the keyboard act as your dedicated take cover button, but you can only take cover when looking directly at the piece of cover that you want to get behind. Now, since this was developed primarily as a PC title, you'd naturally think to just rebind the controls however you want, but that's where things get even weirder. A lot of keys just straight up can't be used by the game. Like, at all. For example, I personally prefer to use the left control key as my crouch button in shooters, but when I went to bind my crouch and prone button to that, I learned that you just can't use the control key in this game whatsoever. I also have a mouse that has some buttons on the side, and I prefer to bind my melee attacks and my grenades to those buttons for easier use on the fly. But the game doesn't support binding actions to the mouse buttons either. So you can customize the controls to an extent, but you're largely stuck with the controls that Capcom made, despite this being a PC shooter developed with mouse and keyboard in mind first and foremost. All that being said though, once you do have things down to being second nature, this game does control really smoothly. The FOV might be a little tight, and some of the animations might feel a bit low budget, but as much as I hate to admit it, playing this game just feels nice. There are also some pretty great mechanics here that are totally unique to Umbrella Corps. For example, zombies can be taken and used as a human shield in combat, and while you can only hold them back from biting you for a short amount of time, this can be a really powerful mechanic if timed properly. It's even sort of helpful in the single player where you're not even against other players, as this mechanic can also be used to take out an enemy safely without using up any of your ammo while doing so. And there's even some solid attention to detail here, with the zombie shield mechanic not being usable with the Ganados or the Magini, as they're just too intelligent to sit there and gnaw on your arm shield while you hold them. And while you can use the mechanic on the Cerberus and other dog-type enemies, you actually can't move around with them, and your time to safely hold them in place is even shorter than it is for your basic zombies due to how much more unruly they are as enemies. This is easily one of the coolest things that Umbrella Corps brings to the table mechanically, but the next one is just as cool and has a much more drastic effect on the gameplay. In Umbrella Corps, every single player has a built-in zombie jammer that prevents zombies and other BOWs from being able to detect you. This jammer is active by default and given to every single player regardless of their loadout choices, and while it might seem broken to just put all these enemies on the maps and then make it so that they can't see you, these jammers are actually a core piece of what makes Umbrella Corps so unique. See, if another player manages to shoot the zombie jammer on your back, it will actually completely stop functioning, which will result in all of the monsters on the map suddenly pathing towards you and trying to kill you. And this adds a really interesting element to the game's multiplayer, as enemy players can try to shoot out your jammer during a gunfight to ensure that even if they die or you manage to escape the fight, the damage will be done and the BOWs will kill you soon enough anyway. And if your jammer gets shot out during a fight, but you still manage to kill the other player, you actually can go over to their body and steal their zombie jammer back to prevent the BOWs from attacking you. But doing so will take a solid few seconds and leave you totally exposed to any enemies around you, so you better make sure that there are no players or monsters around if you try to do so. It's another really cool mechanic that allows players to use the BOWs scattered around the map to their advantage, so I'm actually a really big fan of this one too. Additionally, the cover system in this game is really good in spite of its awkward control scheme. When you enter cover, you'll properly snap into place and pop out at enemies when holding the aim button. Then, when you release the aim button, you'll automatically go back into cover and be protected once again. They've also added some additional things like jumping over waist-high cover and bouncing between pieces of cover that are close to one another, mechanics that were pretty common in other popular third-person shooter systems at the time. And the cover here is incredibly powerful when used properly, as a player who's in cover is nearly impossible to kill unless your aim is absolutely spot on. The only thing that really drags this mechanic down is more of a map design issue than anything, as a lot of the cover placement on these maps is really questionable, with cover often being in places that don't even allow you to peek out at areas where enemies would likely be. This means that while the cover mechanic itself is great, the map design kind of lets it down, since every other piece of cover that you go into just won't be very useful. It is probably the best cover system that we've ever seen from the Resident Evil franchise regardless of this though, so I at least have to give it props for that. This does, however, bring up a general issue that Umbrella Corps seems to have, that being the map design. Now, it should be noted that this game is designed around 4v4 matches, but due to just how dead this game is in 2025, I was only able to play some 1v1s with my girlfriend, who I somehow convinced to help me out, as the response from any other friends that I asked to pick up the game on sale and play it with me was a resounding absolutely not. But even when playing this game against just one other player, the flaws in the map design really started to show. I will say that I think a lot of the maps in this game are generally laid out pretty well aside from the strange cover placement, with some solid movement options, flanking routes, and good objective placements and choke points. But the issue that I found is that the maps in this game are all really small. Even playing simple 1v1 matches, it felt like we were constantly on top of one another, and any time that someone respawned, it was only a matter of seconds until we were in a gunfight again. That might sound like a good thing, and to be fair, for 1v1s, it actually is. But again, consider that that's the experience with 2 players on the map, and the game was meant to be played with 8 players. The spawns in this game are also terrible, as even with just one other player on the map, we would regularly spawn standing right next to the opponent and get spawn killed immediately. In fact, it happened to us so often that I don't believe there's any system in place to check if an enemy player is nearby or has that spawn point in their line of sight, because the game seemingly just picks a random spawn point on the map and throws you right there regardless of where the enemies are. Pair all this with a lightning fast time to kill on even the guns available to you at level 1, and you have an experience that would effectively boil down to spawn, immediately see enemy, get killed in less than a second, repeat. And this is a shame because, like I said, I think the maps are laid out pretty well, and I obviously love seeing so many classic Resident Evil locales on offer here, but a couple of major flaws really hold the map design back. On a more positive note though, Umbrella Corps offers some really solid customization for your character. There are all sorts of pieces of gear that you can unlock as you level up to change your look, and there are even more different colors that you can choose from to really personalize your operative. There's also a ton of customization available for your loadouts, with lots of weapons, attachments, different types of grenades, and of course, colors that you can put on your weapons as well. The only real complaint that I could manage to pick out here is that you can't color every piece of gear on your character, as only certain pieces are available to be customized. But aside from that, everything that I saw here was pretty great, and if you got into this game and played it a lot, you have a ton of options here to customize your own operative with. Stuff like this is pretty important for any kind of multiplayer game that you're going to play for hours on end, so it's good that this is one of the aspects they really nailed down. Overall though, I really didn't enjoy my time with Umbrella Corps that much, but it definitely wasn't as bad as people made it out to be either. There are some genuinely really cool things about this game that make me feel like it would have had a much better reputation had people actually given it a chance. I mean, hell, Operation Raccoon City has a ton of fans out there who played it on release and made great memories with it, leading to a loyal fan base for even one of the most disliked games in the series. So in my opinion, there's absolutely no reason that Umbrella Corps couldn't have had the same. But for me personally, there were just way too many aspects of the game that I disliked from both the single player and the limited experience I was able to get from the multiplayer to really consider myself a fan. At the core of this game, somewhere, there is a really solid third-person shooter, but Capcom's execution here consistently felt sloppy and almost like it was rushed to release too quickly, making for an experience that, for me at least, was more negative than positive. That being said though, if you're a PC player, this game regularly goes on sale for less than $5 on Steam. So if you have any sort of morbid curiosity about this one like I did for so long, I would genuinely recommend checking it out for yourself when it's nice and cheap so you can form your own opinions on it. Who knows, you might end up enjoying it more than I did. Or less, but it could be more. At the end of the day though, based on the experience that I was able to have with the game, I'm going to give Umbrella Corps a 3.8 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't seen them already, or if you're feeling a little extra spicy today, maybe check out the series I did a while back talking about the Ace Combat games. Thank you for watching, and as always, a special thank you to my patrons and channel members for making videos like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel for more reviews like this one in the future. Thank you all once again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.